I'm about to spoil what's going on in Marvel Comics right now with Venom. And trust me, you'll get why in a second. Al Ewing's All-New Venom has been drawing a lot of attention lately for teasing a new host for the classic alien symbiote. Instead of Eddie Brock or Flash Thompson, someone new has been inhabiting the familiar goo of the monster's innards. Someone who has been less edgy, less dark, more excited, more swashbuckling. As for where Eddie Brock is, well, if you're curious about that, he's Carnage now. It's complicated. Don't worry about it. It's a lot. When the comic for All-New Venom first came out, fans suspected everyone from Madame Mask to Robbie Robertson to Rick Jones to current New York City Mayor Luke Cage to be the All-New Venom. But no one, absolutely no one, expected it to be Mary Jane Watson. Yes, Mary Jane Watson, Peter Parker's wife sometimes. That Mary Jane, that one. She's Venom now. Does anyone else feel like this is kind of weird and random and kind of bizarre? I mean, why Mary Jane? Especially considering her trauma with the symbiote. Venom's first appearance left Mary Jane a shivering, terrified mess, so frightened she had to move apartments afterwards. But I think if you look at the history of Mary Jane Watson, you see this instance as part of a trend. And yes, before we get started, it's highly possible that she's not really Venom and just occupying the symbiote temporarily and just Marvel testing the waters and all that. And yes, I am aware that Ewing did say this is a big change that's permanent and going to be around for a while, but they said that about Spider-Man dying during the Superior Spider-Man storyline. You gotta learn not to trust writers' statements at this point in time. I think the problem isn't specifically this instance of Mary Jane being Venom and more of a trend. I mean, hell, it's not even the first time Mary Jane Watson was a symbiote, or was Venom in particular. I think that you have to look at the trends around Mary Jane's character over the last several decades, though, to see why this is so frustrating from a longtime comic fan perspective. Over the last few years, Mary Jane Watson has been pushed into more superheroic roles, either as a powered hero or an assistant to heroes like Spider-Man or even Iron Man. And the reason is Marvel is trying to justify her position in the comics world at all, where she is no longer married to Peter Parker. Why do we need Mary Jane if she's not Peter Parker's wife? Marvel keeps finding ways to push her into the comics without putting her in the slot that fans have loved. And I think a lot of that has to do with the trajectory that Gwen Stacy has taken over the last several years as Marvel turned her into Spider-Gwen, aka Ghost Spider, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's take a few steps back. Let's start off on how Mary Jane and in turn Gwen Stacy were both introduced with Spider-Man, where their arcs went, and how the creative teams and creative decisions over the course of decades pushed both characters into different but similar passages. How Gwen Stacy went from being Peter Parker's main love interest to a ghost to having a renaissance in recent years, and why Mary Jane is floundering in the comics currently, despite celebrating decades of being Peter Parker's one true love. Now, Mary Jane Watson was introduced in the early Spider-Man comics. Her face was hidden at first, and it was some time before Peter Parker encountered her for the first time, stunning him by telling him that he has hit the jackpot. Remember that word, because authors would definitely abuse the jackpot ties to Mary Jane for a while until it became a decaying zombie meme. She existed mainly at this point as a foil to Gwen Stacy. Though Mary Jane Watson was literally the girl next door, she was this feisty, energetic character with dreams and ambitions, while Gwen Stacy, who people forget by the way, initially did bully Peter Parker just a little bit, she felt more like an idealized love interest. She was sweet, vulnerable, kind-hearted. MJ was larger than life, but Gwen Stacy felt down to earth, and that dynamic led into how they were both written from that point on. For a while, Mary Jane was written as someone who wanted to avoid any real decisions of her own, any real pain, any difficult conversations or choices. No. Due to her childhood trauma in an abusive household, she really spent most of her time partying and having fun, though she did have ties to Aunt May through her aunt. I think at the time, many readers might have seen her as a bit superficial, even callous. Now, academics refer to a dynamic called and this is their term, I don't like using the term myself, but the Madonna whore dynamic, where two or more women are created as foils to one another in fiction, where one is saintly and perfect and could do no wrong, while the other is, Well, you heard the other word I said. That's what they kind of dismiss them as. And prior to, say, multiple decisions of different writers and different creators fleshing out both Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane, sometimes for the worst in the case of Gwen Stacy with sins past. Another important thing, Peter could not trust his identity with Gwen. He was always hiding an aspect of himself from her, especially after the death of Gwen's father during a fight between Spidey and Doc Ock. A common occurrence with Spidey's love interests, they tend to like one side of him or the other. They love Peter or they love Spider-Man. But they don't love both, with one key exception that, if you've clicked on this video, you know what the exception is. The dynamic between them was established. Gwen Stacy was perfect. Mary Jane was temptation. She was a party girl with a devil-may-care attitude. But then something important happened to completely deconstruct that dynamic to its core. The tragic death of Gwen Stacy did change the direction that Spider-Man would take, but I think the scene that really established the tone for the next several decades with Mary Jane in particular is the epilogue of issue 122 of The Amazing Spider-Man. It's the epilogue to the night Gwen Stacy died storyline. Now, Norman is dead at this point, but Peter Parker is left without any real catharsis. Sure, the Green Goblin, he's dead, but who cares? Gwen's still dead. Nothing changed, nothing got better. Mary Jane Watson has been waiting at Harry and Peter's apartment for hours since Peter Parker left to go fight the Green Goblin. When Peter Parker finally arrives, Mary Jane tries to say she's torn up about the death, but doesn't really stick the landing quite well. It's not the best of ways to confront someone grieving. And Peter Parker lashes out at her. Peter implies that MJ doesn't really care about anything, that, it's a drag to her party persona, whatever. And Mary Jane could leave right now. She could very well leave, but instead, she stays. She recognizes that Peter's acting out of pain and realizes what he needs is someone to listen to him and someone to be there for him. And I think this moment, it's very brief, it's a page long, but it spoke to readers immensely. It didn't feel forced, like they were saying, let's get rid of Gwen Stacy and put the new love interest in. It felt like a very sincere moment between two different characters. It didn't feel orchestrated, it felt human. And that moment of humanity really did do a lot to break the dynamic that had been established between the two characters previously. It deconstructed it. It kind of blurred the lines. Unfortunately, some writers didn't know what to do with it afterwards. Some Marvel writers tried to rebuild that Madonna, dynamic with Mary Jane now as the Madonna and Felicia Hardy in the secondary role. Felicia is essentially a temptress at the beginning. She is very seductive, very erotic, only interested in Spider-Man's identity as a hero, whereas MJ is clearly worried for Peter whenever he goes missing. Felicia loves Spider-Man, but doesn't care at all for Peter Parker. And Mary Jane, it turns out, not only cares deeply for Peter, but has known Peter more deeply than any previous love interest, because Mary Jane has, since nearly the very beginning of her run in the comics, known Peter was Spider-Man. She watched him leave Aunt May's house one night in costume, was like, I guess Peter's Spider-Man now, and has known this the entire time. So throughout everything, even when knowing what happened to Gwen Stacy, she knew that Peter was Spider-Man. She's known him intimately for years now, and has held back maybe expressing some probing questions or asking things that might make him feel uncomfortable out of respect for his double identity, but is still worried for Peter's safety whenever he goes missing. Whenever Peter lied to her about, I have to go do a thing, and, she sees Spider-Man on the TV or the news, she knows Peter just lied to her, and he's doing this to save people, whatever, but he's also putting himself at risk. And that deeply enriched the dynamic between Mary Jane and Peter Parker. This helped establish three key things. First off, Mary Jane is much smarter than anyone previously gave her credit for. She respects Peter's double identity while also feeling stress from the knowledge that Peter Parker might be in danger. And Mary Jane was someone Peter Parker could trust with both his personal life and his superheroic life. These three pillars of MJ's character made her a far more appealing and interesting love interest than Felicia or Gwen, who often only respected one aspect of Peter's personality, or maybe Peter Parker couldn't trust with every secret. So it felt only natural that after a few years, Peter Parker and Mary Jane would marry. And this will be the last time the writers successfully progressed Peter Parker's story into adulthood in any meaningful capacity with long-term impacts. Peter Parker's marriage to MJ is one of the best arcs, in my opinion, of Spider-Man, because in part it started around the time I was still relatively young and getting into comics, so I'm a little biased there with nostalgia. The Peter Parker I grew up with was married to MJ and starting to become an adult. Yes, he graduated college and all that, but he was really striving into adulthood at this point. And I really liked that as a kid, seeing the progress of Peter's character from teenager to adult to soon-to-be father. That stuff is really interesting and really dynamic. Unfortunately, this would not last at all. The cracks started almost immediately after the wedding, because it became clear the writers weren't totally sure how to write Peter and MJ without some third party competing for Peter Parker's affections. Without the other side of that, Madonna, they were kind of wondering, how do we establish conflict in the relationship? Of course, Black Cat did develop a slight rivalry with MJ when she found out that Peter Parker got married from Venom, as he broke her nose in a fight. That's how she found out that her love interest got married. That's not the best way of finding out. Again, Venom keeps coming up in the story. I'm not sure if that's relevant at all. It might be meaningful, I don't know. A lot of the stories that effectively used Mary Jane had her kind of be anxious for Spider-Man, worried for him, try to encourage him not to take so much responsibility for him, and try to take on jobs that were too big for him. Especially when Carnage first showed up. That's one that stands out to me years later. She's trying to encourage Peter to maybe let the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, handle Carnage. That he doesn't need to put his life on the line for someone like this. And Peter Parker refuses. One great moment is Venom's first appearance. Mary Jane comes home and finds Venom lurking in their apartment, and the sight of Venom frightens her so deeply that she demands that Peter Parker and her move apartments today, because she can't feel safe going back to her apartment thinking that Venom might show up in the corner at any moment. One thing I should note also, MJ and Peter had a very healthy relationship in the bedroom, which I think is important, because going back to that whole Madonna, dynamic, one thing that happens a lot is that the love with the Madonna is chaste. This showed a more realistic life, which a lot of writers somehow struggle with. This felt like a healthy relationship, which for comics puts it leagues above so many other types of characters like Tony Stark or Batman. And for the most part, MJ and Peter's marriage didn't have those instances where there were these random contrived arguments. They understood each other. They supported each other. And when they did argue, it came from a place of love and worry rather than envy or anger or some arbitrary, nonsensical, dumb thing that would felt contrived and forced to add conflict. Consider that. We'll come back to that when we talk about the Raimi films. One work that I think really goes into detail regarding MJ and Peter Parker's personal life is outside the comics. There's a trilogy of Spider-Man novels by Diane Duane from the 90s, starting with The Venom Factor, that really explores the relationship with MJ and Peter Parker, as well as MJ's passions, MJ's drives, in a way that humanizes both characters while still balancing the superheroics in the narrative. It develops the dynamic in a meaningful, realistic way that humanizes MJ way more than a lot of these other storylines in the comics ever did. You're going to notice this is a trend. Most of the works outside the main 616 universe really does a good job developing MJ even into the modern day. We'll get to that more later. When MJ was captured or threatened by a villain, other than with Venom, she could fight back without any superpowers. I think one of my favorite moments is actually outside the comics, and it's in the Jim Butcher novel, Spider-Man: The Darkest Hours. Jim Butcher being the same guy who did the Dresden Files. So MJ is rehearsing for the role of Lady Macbeth, and she hears that Spider-Man and Black Cat are fighting the siblings of Morlun. One of the most powerful villains Spider-Man's ever faced. MJ naturally gets in her car while practicing for the role of Lady Macbeth and plows them down, the villains. She just runs them over with her car while reciting Lady Macbeth's lines over and over again, which is frankly one of the most badass things Mary Jane has ever done. And keep in mind, these are the inheritors. the same villains responsible for the original Spider-Verse storyline. And MJ is plowing them down with her car. These people who take down Spider-Man, like, left and right, and it's MJ who ends up beating them with a car. It's great. I love it. It's so goofy and over the top, but it's so fun. It's emblematic of what writers could do if they weren't cowards with MJ. Oh, then there's the Marc Millar storyline of Spider-Man, where Green Goblin tries to capture MJ again and, to recreate the Gwen Stacy death scene. And as Spider-Man and Green Goblin are fighting, MJ pulls out a handgun and unloads a full clip into Green Goblin. It's great. And while she is knocked off the bridge like Gwen Stacy is, Spider-Man shows he is willing to learn from his errors and tries to slow MJ's descent down. Because with Gwen Stacy, the reason why she died wasn't because she hit anything, it's because the web that caught her was so abrupt it snapped her neck. So this time Spider-Man's like, you know what, I'm not taking any chances. Rapid fire web shooting, slow the descent so that we don't have a sharp stop, but rather a slow, gentle decline. And it saves MJ's life. It shows that Spider-Man's learned that MJ is a lot more assertive than people give it credit for, and how the Green Goblin apparently can't think of anything new to do to Spider-Man. That would later change. But throughout all this, there were a lot of issues. There were a lot of moments where MJ's arc could have gone in a direction that was interesting, but then they stopped it. Early on, for example, there was the MJ smoking arc, where MJ takes up cigarettes to deal with the stress of Peter Parker's double identity. This went nowhere. It just kind of stopped one day. Then there was the pregnancy arc, where Peter Parker and Mary Jane conceive a child, and thanks to the Green Goblin again, that child ends up being stillborn. It's horrible and it's disturbing, and very quickly brushed under the rug, I might add, by the writers. It seems like a odd thing to kind of forget. Oh, and then there's the time that MJ was in a plane that exploded. Everyone thought she was dead, and it turned out she was kidnapped by a stalker instead. And the plane was just like a false flag to hide the fact that the stalker was kidnapping MJ. The fact that no one references this story should tell you how little it really mattered in the scheme of things. When Peter Parker saves MJ from the stalker, she's so shaken by this that she needs time to collect her thoughts and temporarily separates from Peter Parker. This was the first occasion where it looked like Spider-Man editors were trying to make Peter Parker a single guy again, but this didn't last very long. The JMS run of Spider-Man, which is, again, introduced Moreland, quickly put Peter Parker and MJ back together as Peter Parker was taking up a job as a high school teacher. The JMS run of Spider-Man is widely regarded as one of the best arcs of Spider-Man. He's maturing, he has some great encounters, his supporting cast is well developed, but what ends up happening is the JMS run culminates in one more day. After Civil War and Spider-Man exposes his identity to the world, Kingpin takes revenge on Spider-Man by shooting Aunt May. The only person who can stop a bullet wound, not Doctor Strange, Doctor Doom, Dr. Octopus, none of them. No. It's Mephisto, the literal devil of the Marvel Universe, who asks for Peter Parker's marriage in exchange for saving Aunt May, and both Peter Parker and MJ accept the terms. It is one of the most hated storylines in comic book history. One More Day is really emblematic of the cracks that have been forming the whole time. How do writers write Peter Parker if he's in a happy relationship? They don't know how to do it. Or at least some don't. Or at least the editorial felt there wasn't a way to do it. Joe Quesada was the editor-in-chief at the time. In an interview with CBR back in 2008, Quesada explained why One More Day had to happen.
Bottom line, there are so many things that 20-somethings are doing with their lives that a married Peter can't. He needs to be a single guy. Sure, he can have a girlfriend. That adds something to his story. But a married Peter just cuts off too many avenues for good soap opera. Could you have soap opera within a marriage? Sure. But after a while, there's only so much tension you can bring into Peter and MJ's marriage before you make him seem like a louse of a husband, or her like a bickering wife. In contrast, you can play them as a happy-go-lucky couple for so long. That adds up to zero tension within the relationship, and takes away a crucial element of Spider-Man stories, the soap opera.
I think this is an ass-backwards take. The idea that a relationship has to be a source of conflict in a story is ludicrous. What frustrates me the most is that this is all saying that MJ and Spider-Man being happy removes conflict, and that Spider-Man needs to be separate from MJ to have that conflict in his life, to have more stories opened up to him. But what is never considered is how MJ and Spider-Man separating impacts MJ's storyline. Mary Jane was, for years, Spider-Man's closest companion, his friend, his lover, his wife. And by removing a key element of how it developed Mary Jane, it felt like you were taking away a key element of her character as well. But the writers weren't concerned with that. Carly Cooper was introduced as Peter Parker's new girlfriend, and Carly never really found the balance that Mary Jane, Gwen, or Felicia did with Spider-Man. The dynamic felt like she was just the replacement for MJ. Carly was quickly kind of scrapped under the rug a little bit, and she became more interesting when not Peter Parker's girlfriend, when not being forced into that role, but even then never found her footing the same way that Mary Jane, Gwen, or Felicia did. The problem is that fans were invested in Peter Parker maturing with Mary Jane. Any new love interest would be seen as the replacement for Mary Jane after Peter Parker sold his marriage to Marvel's devil. This lack of direction for MJ is pretty clear because the next decade was spent teasing MJ getting back together with Peter, but everyone kind of knew it wasn't going to happen, considering the last time MJ and Peter got together, the devil stepped in to ruin that. Now, I do want to bring up something else I've been teasing for a while, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. Mary Jane is the primary love interest in that, and while Kirsten Dunst, I think, is physically perfect for the role, I think the way she's written deeply affected how audiences saw Mary Jane. Raimi did not adapt Mary Jane very well. She fails to communicate any of the core tenets that made Mary Jane appealing to audiences in the first place. In the Raimi films, she's primarily a damsel in distress. She is idolized by both Harry and Peter, and exists more as a prize for either to win, rather than her own character. In that Madonna, she's pure Madonna. She's very simplified. Her acting ambitions play a small role in the first two films, with them only playing into her breakup with Peter in the third film. And she isn't good at acting in the movies. So it's like kind of sad. It doesn't feel like she's pushing and trying to strive for something and advancing the same way she is in the comics, where she's getting soap opera roles, movie roles, practicing Lady Macbeth while plowing down supervillains in a car. Again, I can't get over that scene. It's so cool. Most of the Raimi, MJ, and Peter interactions are either them kissing, whispering about their relationship, or arguing over contrived nonsense. There are so few scenes of them mutually supporting each other as they are in the comics. There's no scene of MJ fearing for Peter Parker's life after knowing he's Spider-Man. There's none of that. All the conversations are defined by envy, frustration, or self-pity. At this point in the comics, Mary Jane was a fully fleshed out character, a very assertive figure. And it doesn't make sense why Raimi wrote them like this, or had them presented like this. When it came to the Marc Webb The Amazing Spider-Man duology, they switched out Mary Jane with Gwen Stacy. And I think it's pretty clear watching these movies that Marc Webb, the guy who made 500 this summer, was way more invested in the love story between Gwen and Peter than Raimi was telling the love story between Peter and MJ. The chemistry was better between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. Unlike Raimi MJ, Webb Stacy actually helped Spider-Man out. She even knocked over a supervillain with her car. I mean, she wasn't reading Lady Macbeth, but, not everyone could be perfect like MJ. I think the popularity of Gwen in The Amazing Spider-Man led to Marvel wanting a little bit of synergy with the films. And that led to them thinking, how can we bring Gwen Stacy back? Well, we can't retcon her death right now. They've done that since. We can't clone her again, though they brought the clone back too from the original Clone Saga. Instead, we're going to make an alternate timeline where Gwen Stacy becomes Spider-Man instead of Peter Parker. And that led to the Spider-Gwen character, aka Ghost Spider. The design of Ghost Spider is fantastic. Look at that design. It's so cool and simple, yet so effective and distinct. And that led to her appearing in the Spider-Verse films, where she essentially became a co-lead alongside Peter B. Parker and the real star of the movie, Miles Morales. There's even that pre-K cartoon, Spidey and His Amazing Friends, that elevates Gwen Stacy to a co-lead alongside Peter and Miles. I bet you didn't expect to discuss a show for literal babies on this video, but hey, it's successful for Disney and it influences their marketing decisions, You get them young and then you build them up later on with more content when they grow up. So the question becomes this: how do they make Mary Jane into Ghost Spider, into Spider-Gwen? Well, the short answer is, you don't. But they sure tried. Mary Jane opens up a nightclub in Chicago, and it's almost immediately destroyed by Iron Man during a fight. Now, Iron Man feels kind of bad about this, so he decides to hire MJ as a personal assistant at Stark Industries. And this is around the same time that Peter Parker created his own company called Parker Industries. Don't remember Parker Industries? Don't worry, it didn't last either, because any attempt to make Spider-Man grow up is immediately pulled back by Marvel editorial. Spider-Man cannot progress without backtracking almost immediately. But let's talk about Tony Stark and MJ for a bit. MJ would become a supporting character in Tony's world for a while, completely divorced from Spider-Man, and this was an attempt to give MJ an arc independent of Spider-Man, to say, hey, we can take MJ and put her anywhere and make her have her own distinct story. She helped with Riri Williams back in the day, becoming Ironheart. She helped manage Stark Industries when Tony was temporarily dead. Don't worry, he got better. This was done in order to make MJ an independent character, but this didn't last, because Mary Jane is perpetually tied in with Spider-Man. Even in Tony Stark's storylines, Spider-Man kept being slotted in at some point. But what's important here is what happened with the villain Regent, because this moment, I think, defined MJ's arc in the future. Now, Regent was a vigilante who Spider-Man and Iron Man fought, and there's more to it than that, but for the sake of this video, it doesn't really matter. The point is that MJ, in order to save Tony Stark and her ex-husband, threw on Peter Parker's Iron Spider costume and fought Regent. While she didn't win, she bought the heroes enough time to regroup and fight back. This was Marvel testing the waters with MJ, making her a superhero in her own right, using technology to level the playing field with the other superheroes. Now later, MJ would actually team up with Black Cat for a few storylines and wear a Black Cat costume and go on adventures with Black Cat. And they toyed with the idea again of MJ having a superhero identity. And it was a well-received arc. What is important is that MJ was taking on a more assertive role in the Marvel Universe as a hero in her own right. The problem is, all of the identities she wore were other characters' costumes. She was wearing her ex-husband's costume. She was wearing her ex-love rival's costume. She was working with Tony Stark. At no point was she given a sense of she is this character uniquely. But that would change. And it would change after some controversial storytelling. There's this arc involving a character, Kindred. Now, Kindred, he's the genetically engineered child of Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn, created by Harry Osborn and Mendel Stromm. Essentially, it's a retcon to the Sin's past storyline that implied that Gwen Stacy and Norman had an affair prior to Green Goblin killing Gwen Stacy, and that MJ walked in on it or heard about it and knew this entire time and didn't tell Peter about it. I mean, it's a retcon to one of the most poorly received comics of all time. The specifics don't really matter for the intentions of what we're talking about here. But what matters is that towards the end of that arc, it finally seemed that MJ and Peter Parker were reconciling. After years of Marvel trying to make MJ her own character, divorced from Peter, it felt like at last they were coming back together. She'd had time to grow, had time to develop on her own, but now two fully fleshed out adults could form a new relationship, and then fucking Paul showed up. Zeb Wells delivered one of the worst received runs of modern Spider-Man by forcing Mary Jane into a found family with some guy named Paul. Paul forms a pseudo-family with MJ after spending time in isolation with MJ and some alternate... Do you really care? Do you really care why Paul exists? Do you really care at all? Does it matter? The reason why Paul was with MJ doesn't really matter. It's incidental. What matters is that Paul exists at all, impeding the natural progress between MJ and Spider-Man getting together. When it felt like the relationship was finally healing and going in the right direction after Tony Stark, after all of that, we got Paul. Paul was not hated because he's a particularly bad character. He's a particularly nothing character. No one cares about who Paul really is. What they care about is what Paul represents. Marvel editorial stepping in as the writing naturally progresses to a certain endpoint to go, no, we can't have Peter Parker or Mary Jane grow up and form a family and relate to each other. We have to impede it so we can have the will they won't they drama extended ad nauseum. We have to present alternate girlfriends to Peter Parker to show, hey, maybe there's a chance Peter Parker won't end up with Mary Jane, even though none of these other love interests are well received by the fan audience. Fans just want MJ and Peter Parker to marry and have a family. They continue to circle each other around the drain for decades at this point, with a will they won't they storyline that was concluded back in the 80s with a they will. And then there's Paul. He's just there. He's a roadblock for both characters being a healthy, happy relationship together. They can't have kids together, but Mary Jane can adopt interdimensional children that disappear after a couple months, because Marvel wants the drama. The characters we want to see grow up and have a healthy relationship over time, we can't have that because Peter Parker has to be a bachelor, because it opens up the door to more stories. More stories, of course, that fans have routinely rejected because it's the same story over and over and over again. You know what opened up new stories? Having Mary Jane and Peter Parker have a family, raising kids. Spider-Verse did it. Oh, and what makes it more frustrating is how they dragged other characters through the mud to justify this Paul nonsense. Most specifically, Kamala Khan. Kamala Khan dies saving Mary Jane from some villain. I know I'm oversimplifying it here. The villain is like Paul's father from a Hell Dimension place. It's really stupid. Don't worry about it. It's not important. All you gotta know is that he had to kill Mary Jane. By killing Kamala Khan, things get wrong for him. He gets screwy, he gets killed off, but who cares? Kamala Khan dies protecting a character she didn't interact with to complete another story she has no involvement in, and is mourned by characters who don't know her. And it's all Paul's fault. Don't worry, Kamala Khan gets better too in Krakoa and becomes a mutant because, and in fact, her return was announced the day after she died in the comics. Stirred up controversy to sell issues, and then a day later we're told, no, don't worry, she'll get better. It's okay. She'll be back. It's like, again, it's marketing routines. All it is just dumb marketing. We're being teased and pulled in directions just so that they can have their cake and eat it. So they can have all these different stories that open up the door to new stories, but really it's the same story over and over again. They're refusing to let these characters grow up, and it comes at the expense of a character that audiences have liked for years being pulled into contrived, dumb stories that are immediately criticized for their artificiality. And as I said before, then the alternate reality kids die, and that's bad. It's, again, they keep killing Mary Jane's children in these runs again and again, and they just kind of go, okay, let's brush the kids off so we can push MJ into the next arc. One thing that happens when MJ is in that alternate dimension with Paul is that Paul designs some magical technology, triggering luck-based powers for MJ. Essentially, she rolls the roulette on her wrist, and whatever she gets results in some powers. Or immediate death, but let's not talk about that possibility too much right now. And thus becomes Jackpot. At this point in time, MJ and Paul are still living together, going through couples therapy. Why she hasn't moved back to Peter Parker is anyone's guess. But don't worry, they have another kid, and they've adopted Dylan Brock. In the current comics, MJ and Paul are raising Dylan Brock. You don't know who Dylan Brock is? Don't worry, let me explain in brief. Dylan Brock is the three-way child of Venom and Wayne and Eddie Brock. Yes, I said Venom the symbiote. It's a whole thing. Dylan Brock is basically the spawn of Venom's codex. He was Venom for a while, but lost access to the symbiote. And look, this is what's so baffling. Again, Eddie Brock terrified Mary Jane. She is traumatized by Venom. This is a key element in the beginning Venom storylines. And now she's adopting Dylan Brock. Dylan Brock wants to reunite with his symbiote, because he was Venom for a while too. And things happen, shenanigans, gold symbiote, yada, yada, yada. And now it looks like Mary Jane is Venom? This new Venom? When her adoptive son wants to become Venom again, Mary Jane becomes Venom? What about being Jackpot? It feels weird, right? She immediately gets her own distinct identity, and then it's immediately eclipsed by becoming Venom after adopting Dylan Brock. She's again being reassimilated into another character storyline. Even though Venom started off as a Spider-Man villain, he's become this distinct character with his own unique lore, his own unique backstory. It's the same thing as Mary Jane being tied in with Tony Stark. They're taking Mary Jane and saying, no, she can stand on her own. Let's shove her in with another character with his old supporting cast and slot her in there and just see what happens. And yes, I am aware that there are other Jackpots aside from Mary Jane. But there's a huge distinction between someone taking up the mantle of a lesser-known character and becoming the newest Venom. And again, I find it strange how they keep putting Mary Jane into symbiote costumes. This keeps happening. In the Spider-Gwen Earth 65 continuity, she becomes Carnage. In the Insomniac Spider-Man games, she assumes the mantle of Scream. I think it's just odd, because she's traumatized by the symbiotes, yet they keep putting her into symbiotes. And they forget how traumatized she was initially by it. It just seems like a weird decision to make, and I question what the point is. Oh, and if you had any doubts, there is no chance of Peter and MJ ever getting back together. If you need any more proof, here's a quote from Marvel's executive editor himself.
Plenty of things have happened to Peter Parker and Spider-Man over the past 17 years, and most all of them have mattered, both to the character and to the audience. Things change in the world of Spider-Man all the time, always have. So sometimes he has a black costume and then he doesn't. And sometimes he's a school teacher and then he isn't. And sometimes he's married and then he isn't. And sometimes Dr. Octopus takes over his body and then he gets it back. It's all kind of the same thing. But as always, if you just don't like Spider-Man without him being married to MJ, you can always stop reading it or simply read Ultimate Spider-Man at this point, whichever suits you.
And what's so bizarre is that fans have for years been telling Marvel what they want, and writers and artists outside the constraints of the 616 universe have been delivering. Let's go back to that baby subplot back in the 90s that closed out the Clone Saga. Mary Jane and Peter Parker have a baby. It's a stillborn. A what-if storyline proposed the question, however, what if the baby Peter Parker and MJ conceived survived? Enter the MC2 universe, an alternate future of Marvel that started thanks to Marvel responding to the popularity of a single what-if comic and fans wanting to see what would happen if Mary Jane and Peter Parker's adult life could progress. And that led to the creation of one of the more popular alternate reality Spider-Men, Mayday Parker, Spider-Girl. In this alternate timeline, Peter Parker retires as Spider-Man after a final battle with the Green Goblin. He loses his leg, Norman Osborn loses his life. Years later, May Parker, Peter Parker's daughter, assumes the role of Spider-Man, in this case, Spider-Girl. Now, MJ is a supporting character in this storyline, but she feels like a natural progression. She feels like a mother looking after her daughter, worried for her husband, and worried for her kid. It leaves off where the Clone Saga left off, with both characters maturing, raising a family, etc. During the first Spider-Verse storyline, the MC2 Peter Parker dies, and Mary Jane is left fighting for her children from the Inheritors. Though granted, unlike in that one book, she's not plowing them down with a truck while reciting the lines from Lady Macbeth. Seriously, that scene's so badass. Anyway, what started as a series of alternate looks at Peter Parker's future leads to a more interesting world, where Peter Parker and MJ could retain their marriage, could start a family, could tell interesting stories. If anything, raising a child, a family, that opened the door up to new stories, new possibilities that didn't just repeat what came before. The success of Spider-Girl in the MC2 led Marvel to playing more with alternate timelines where Mary Jane and Peter Parker could grow up together and grow old together. And while some alternate timelines like Spider-Man Reign are more well known for how contrivably depressing they are, like MJ dying of cancer from Peter Parker's radioactive, bodily fluids, most involved Mary Jane and Peter Parker raising kids, with those kids themselves having superpowers thanks to coming from Spider-Man. And these stories are well received. Renew Your Vows, Ultimate Spider-Man. These storylines are very popular among fans because it shows what could have happened with Peter Parker and MJ, them growing older into their 40s and even 50s, raising children, having a family of superpowered characters, and MJ herself having to maybe figure out how to fight alongside her family or protect her family from threats the only way she knows how. She doesn't have any superpowers, but she does have intelligence, and she does have family members, in this case Peter Parker, who can build advanced technology so that she can help support her family in more than one way. What's really fascinating about Renew Your Vows especially is it gave Mary Jane a superior identity, Spinneret. And while she doesn't have any inherent power, she uses technology to replicate her husband's and children's powers, allowing her to fight alongside her entire family. Normally, she'd have to watch Peter Parker and her children go and fight crime on their own and feels helpless from the sidelines. But here, she's able to help support them out there, and I think that's great. And yes, Spinneret also merges with Venom. Mary Jane being a mother doesn't limit her character, it expands it. And their relationship is not boring with kids. It's interesting, it's dynamic. One of the big reasons that the Ultimate relaunch became a success was because it promised the idea that Mary Jane and Spider-Man would raise a family. And these storylines feel organic. Peter Parker is progressing in life, Mary Jane is progressing in life. They're not being forced apart by any contrived wrenches in the system. They are naturally two people who are destined to be together, and they're able to raise a happy family together, dealing with the struggles of life, of course, like any good Spider-Man story does, without it feeling like Marvel is pulling them apart to insert characters like fucking Paul. They're able to go to the next step of their life, the next chapter, unlike mainstream Marvel. What I find funny about all this is how Peter B. Parker from Spider-Verse illustrates how compelling a character like Spidey could be. How Peter could grow up and lose MJ, but ultimately things work out and he's able to rebuild his life by making the right choices. And Peter loses MJ based on his own choices. There isn't some outside force wedged in to make things worse. MJ being lost or gained is entirely due to Peter's decisions. I've seen some people say this new arc is relatable, that it illustrates realistically how people can drift apart and lose touch over time. And to that I say, comics are melodrama. All of it is by design. If Peter is going to be miserable, it should feel organic to Peter's choices, so that it feels validating to the reader to read. If MJ is going to be distant and all that, it should be due to their choices, not by some circumstances of fate like this. Like trauma, being kidnapped, or being trapped in hell with one guy named Paul. Paul forces the storyline down a path that is entirely inorganic to the melodrama. It feels artificial. But then again, so did Peter Parker and MJ selling their marriage to the devil as well. And what makes it all the more frustrating is how other characters are able to grow up. In this case, Sue Storm. Sue Storm is able to have multiple children, marry her husband. The marriage is never threatened, and outside the occasional occasions where, like, say, she dresses in leather and gets all edgy for a day, they're able to maintain a happy, stable relationship, and fans love it. Lois Lane has been married to Superman for just as long as Peter Parker has, but unlike with Peter Parker, outside of universe relaunching events, nothing is splitting them apart. And what's strange about all this is that it doesn't seem like Mary Jane's considerations as a character are ever considered by Marvel. Sure, Peter Parker is forced into the Eternal Bachelor role, but Mary Jane keeps getting children who she has to watch die. She has to watch her children die again and again. She has to have a stillborn child. Her interdimensional children have to disappear, and I'm sure Dylan Brock is going to be ripped from her arms soon enough too. It just seems like Marvel doesn't value her happiness, her direction, her role in the narrative. Whenever she's given a chance to develop, she's dragged back into some contrived, forced situation where she cannot evolve on her own. And I think what makes everything more emblematic of that is that characters like Paul end up being the driving force of these characters' lives as opposed to their own decisions. They are slotted in, and the whole narrative that they were choosing to go down is redirected by some guy named Paul. Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? I question their judgment every single day.